out! She owns nothing now! You are nothing, but a worthless piece of trash.
Madame Virelda screamed, pointing toward the storm beyond the gates. She owns nothing now. Rain hammered the windows of Ashbourne Estate as servants stood frozen in terror. Trunks were hurled down the staircase, chairs scraped across marble floors. Portraits of dead ancestors crashed to the ground as men tore the manor apart room by room. At the center of the ruin stood Lady Seraphine, a grieving widow dressed in black, pale from sorrow, yet refusing to bow. Only months ago she had walked these halls as mistress of the estate. She had fed hungry servants, paid for medicine from her own purse, and brought warmth to a house grown cold with pride. Now the same halls echoed with insults. "Drag her outside," Virelda barked. "Let her learn how beggars sleep." Some servants wept quietly. Others lowered their eyes in shame. None dared move. The bailiff, Mr. Pelmore, stepped forward with a cruel smile and seized Seraphine by the arm. "You heard the lady." Thunder cracked above the manor. The doors rattled in the wind. Still Seraphine said nothing. She only clutched an old torn shawl tightly against her chest, the one possession she would not let them touch. Virelda laughed at the sight. Look at her, protecting rags as if they were treasure. She shoved Seraphine toward the flooded stone steps. One more push, and the widow would be thrown into the rain like refuse. Then hooves thundered across the courtyard. Fast, many, closer with every breath. The servants gasped. Pelmore released her. Even Virelda turned pale. The great doors burst open. Who were they, and why had they come at the very moment she was being cast out? Subscribe now, because what happened next brought the entire estate to its knees. Ashbourne Estate had once been the pride of the county. Its stone towers overlooked green fields, its gardens had drawn visitors from distant towns, and music used to drift from its ballroom on winter nights. Now the place stood tired and wounded. Rainwater slipped through cracked sections of the roof and dripped into buckets placed along the corridors. Curtains had faded from years of neglect. The fountain in the front court was dry, filled only with dead leaves and muddy water. Since the death of Lord Halvrid, silence had settled over the house like dust. Lady Seraphine moved through those dim halls in black mourning clothes, her face pale from sorrow and restless nights. Though much younger than her late husband, she had loved him with true loyalty. He had treated her with gentleness when others mocked their marriage and whispered that she married for comfort. Those voices had grown louder after his burial, but Seraphine never answered them. She had discovered too late that Lord Halvrid's kindness had hidden many burdens. Loans unpaid, taxes delayed, promises signed years before she arrived. Men with ledgers and hard eyes now came to the manor gates each week, demanding money she did not have. To save the estate, Seraphine sold nearly everything of value. First went her pearl earrings, then silver trays from the dining room, then carved chairs, rugs from the east wing, and even the grand piano Lord Halvrid had loved to hear after supper. Each cart that rolled away seemed to carry another memory with it. The servants watched with heavy hearts. Many had served the family for decades, yet fear kept them quiet. They whispered in kitchens and passageways, wondering how long they would remain employed. Madame Virelda, wife of the steward, had become bold since the lord's death. She carried keys at her waist as if she owned the house. She entered rooms without knocking, corrected servants loudly, and spoke to Seraphine with open disrespect. "You should be grateful to remain indoors at all," she said one cold morning while taking inventory of the pantry. "Some widows are not so fortunate." Seraphine gave no reply. She simply pulled her old dark shawl tighter around her shoulders. She wore it every day and never allowed anyone to touch it. That night, she sat alone in the library beside a weak fire, reading a letter written in Lord Halvred's trembling hand. "If danger ever comes, trust the crest and the guard who still remembers." She turned the page again and again, but there was nothing more. At dawn, sharp knocking echoed through the manor. A clerk stood at the door, holding stamped papers sealed in red wax. Lady Seraphine was ordered to leave Ashbourne Estate in 3 days. Morning came dark as evening. Thick clouds smothered the sky, and heavy rain beat against Ashbourne Estate without pause. Water ran down the stone lions at the front steps and gathered in wide puddles across the courtyard. 2 large carts waited by the gate, their wheels sunk in mud, while nervous horses stamped and shook their heads against the weather. Inside the manor, the final humiliation had begun. Mr. Pelmore, the bailiff, entered with a bundle of legal papers tucked beneath his coat. He was a narrow man with stiff collar, thin lips, and eyes that showed no pity. Behind him came 4 rough porters, smelling of wet wool and ale. They carried ropes, blankets, and iron hooks for lifting furniture. Madame Verelda followed close behind, wrapped in a costly fur coat she had never worn before. She moved through the hall with a smile too bright for such a morning. "How quickly greatness melts," she said, glancing at Seraphine. "Yesterday mistress of the estate, today another burden to the road." Lady Seraphine stood near the staircase in a plain black dress, her hands folded, the old dark shawl resting over her shoulders. Her face was pale but composed. She gave Verelda no answer. The porters began at once. Cabinets were emptied, chairs scraped over marble floors. A portrait of Lord Halvred was taken from the wall and leaned carelessly against a trunk. In the dining room, silver candle stands were wrapped and packed beside crystal glasses. From the servants' corridor came quiet weeping. They remembered the widow's kindness. She had once paid for cook's daughter to see a physician when fever nearly took the child. She had sent bread and broth to stable boys during winter storms. When wages were late, she shared from her own purse and never asked to be thanked. Now those same servants could do nothing but watch. Pelmore seemed irritated by Seraphine's silence. "You may plead for time if you wish, though it will do no good." "I shall not plead," she replied. His jaw tightened. He ordered the men to move faster. Drawers were dumped onto carpets. A small music box was tossed into a crate until one maid gasped aloud. Then a porter reached for the shawl around Seraphine's shoulders. Her hand caught his wrist instantly. "Touch anything else," she said, her voice cold and sharp. "Not that." The room fell still. Even Pelmore stared. Verelda threw back her head and laughed. "Protecting rags now. Drag her outside." Thunder rolled across the hills. Then through the roar of rain came the pounding sound of horses racing towards the manor gates. The pounding of hooves grew louder until it shook the front doors on their hinges. Rain sprayed through the cracks as horses skidded across the courtyard stones. Before anyone could speak, the great doors were thrown open, and 6 riders entered the hall in a rush of cold air and storm mist. They wore dark blue cloaks fastened with silver clasps. Beneath them gleamed polished breastplates marked with the royal seal. Swords hung at their sides, wet with rain. At their head stood an older man with a scar across his jaw and streaks of grey at his temples. His posture was straight, his gaze sharp and disciplined. Captain Aldrich. The porters stepped back at once. Servants pressed themselves against the walls. Mr. Pelmore recovered first. "This is a lawful eviction," he said, waving his papers. "You have no authority here." Madame Virelda pointed toward the doors. "Take your mud and horses elsewhere. This is private property." Aldrich did not even glance at them. His eyes rested only on Lady Seraphine. She stood motionless near the staircase, rainlight falling across her pale face. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with grave care, he removed one glove and bowed deeply before her. Gasps broke through the room. No one had ever bowed to Seraphine in such a manner. When he rose, his voice was low and steady. "My lady, I must see the crest." Seraphine's breath caught. Her fingers trembled as she touched the seam inside her old shawl. Slowly she pulled back the lining. Hidden beneath the worn cloth was an embroidered emblem, faded by years, a silver stag beneath a 7-point crown. The instant it was revealed, every guard dropped to one knee. Pelmore's papers slipped from his hands. Virelda stared as though struck senseless. Captain Aldrich lifted his head and spoke so all could hear. "Behold, Princess Elira, lost daughter of the sovereign line." The hall erupted in cries and whispers. One maid burst into tears. A porter crossed himself. Even thunder outside seemed distant beside the shock within those walls. Aldrich explained what many had only heard as an old tragedy. Years ago, fire consumed the royal nursery. In the confusion, the infant princess vanished. The kingdom mourned her death. Yet one loyal nurse had escaped the flames, carrying the child, hiding them among common folk to save her from those who wished the royal line ended. Seraphine swayed as the truth struck her like a blow. Her knees weakened. Every lonely year, every unanswered question, every strange warning now carried meaning. She covered her mouth and wept openly. Across the hall, Madame Virelda collapsed to her knees in terror. The great hall of Ashbourne Estate changed within minutes. Where porters had dragged furniture and creditors had barked orders, royal guards now stood in a firm line beneath the chandeliers. Rain tapped the high windows, while broken crates, scattered ledgers, and overturned chairs lay across the marble floor like evidence in a trial. Captain Aldrich stepped forward and bowed towards Seraphine. "Your Great Grace, these people acted against you. By your word, judgment shall be given." Madame Virelda crawled across the floor, her fur coat twisted and stained with mud from the entrance. "Mercy, my lady," she cried, clutching at her hem. "I did not know who you were. Had I known, I would have served you faithfully." Seraphine looked down at the woman who had mocked her grief, stolen her keys, and ordered her into the storm. Her face remained calm, though pain moved behind her eyes.
You believed I was powerless. I bade no mercy.
The words struck the room into silence. She turned to Captain Aldrich. "Madame Virelda is stripped of all authority. She is to leave this estate today and be known in every neighbouring county for her conduct. No respectable household shall employ her." Virelda let out a cry of disbelief as two guards lifted her to her feet. Seraphine then faced Mr. Pelmore, who had gone pale as wax. This man used false charges, unlawful seizure, and cruelty under colour of law. Aldrich nodded to his men. Pelmore was seized before he could speak. He will answer before the royal court, the captain declared. Seraphine's gaze moved across the carts in the courtyard. Everything taken from this house is to be returned at once. Servants broke into tears and muffled cheers. The cook covered her mouth and sobbed. The old groundsman bowed until his forehead nearly touched the floor. A young maid smiled through tears, clutching the medicine pouch Seraphine had once bought for her sick mother. Yet Seraphine felt no triumph. While others rejoiced, she walked alone through the wounded manor. She passed walls she had dusted herself when staff grew few, past empty shelves where portraits had hung, past the breakfast room where she once poured tea for her husband. Her fingers touched the worn banister, the cracked plaster, the cold stone doorway. Memories rose with every step. Captain Aldrich found her at the front entrance, where the rain had softened to mist. "The king is old and failing. He asks for you. Court must be reached without delay." Seraphine turned and looked back at Ashbourne Estate. "I entered this house as a stranger. I leave as its protector." The royal palace rose above the capital like a city of stone and gold. High towers pierced the grey sky, banners moved in the wind, and long rows of windows caught the afternoon light. As Seraphine's carriage passed through the iron gates, she stared in silence. She had crossed grand halls before as a guest beside Lord Halvard, yet nothing compared to this place built for crowns and command. Inside, polished floors reflected chandeliers bright as stars. Marble pillars lined the corridors. Portraits of rulers watched from carved frames. Servants in spotless uniforms bowed as she passed, though many did so with curious eyes rather than warmth. Some nobles greeted her with smiles in careful words. Others stood apart in clusters, whispering behind gloved hands. A lost princess restored meant old plans could crumble. Titles, lands, and future marriages might now shift with her arrival. Captain Aldrich led her through guarded doors into the king's private chamber. The room smelled faintly of herbs, wax, and burning coal. Heavy curtains softened the light. Upon a carved bed lay an old man wrapped in blankets, his once powerful frame reduced by illness. When he saw Seraphine, tears filled his eyes at once. She carried the same brow, the same dark lashes, the same calm expression as Queen Mylora, who had died years after losing her child. "My daughter," he whispered, voice shaking, "the face of your mother has returned to me." Seraphine knelt beside him, overcome with emotions too tangled to name. The king held her hand with trembling fingers and confirmed what Aldrich had declared. Marks known only to the royal physician, the hidden crest, and the testimony of the nurse had long ago proven the truth. Before father and daughter could speak further, the chamber doors opened sharply. Lord Varkane entered without invitation. Tall, richly dressed, and silver-haired, he wore confidence like armor. Behind him came two clerks carrying sealed documents. "This woman is no princess," he announced. "I present records proving the infant perished in the nursery fire. She is an impostor placed here to deceive the crown." Gasps spread through the chamber. He demanded Seraphine be confined until an inquiry could be held. Aldrich's expression hardened. He later told Seraphine in private that Varkane had risen greatly after the fire and had always opposed questions about that night. For the first time since learning the truth, fear touched her heart. Whoever stole her life years ago might still command influence inside these very walls. That evening, exhausted, she sat alone in her chamber. A tray arrived with warm bread, fruit preserves, and steaming tea. She lifted the cup. From the doorway, a maid screamed, "Do not drink that!" The maid rushed forward and struck the teacup from Seraphine's hand. Porcelain shattered across the floor, sending dark liquid over the carpet. A bitter almond scent rose sharply into the room. The young maid trembled as she fell to her knees. "My brother works in the lower kitchens," she cried. "He heard a man order this tray changed." Captain Aldrich had the cup tested before midnight. Poison was confirmed. Seraphine did not panic. By morning, fear had hardened into resolve. At the next royal gathering, nobles filled the great audience chamber beneath painted ceilings and tall windows of coloured glass. Silk gowns brushed polished floors. Rings flashed on lifted hands. Lord Varkane stood among them, calm and certain, believing the attempt had failed without suspicion. The king, pale and weak, was carried to his throne. Seraphine stood beside him in ivory silk, her expression steady. Captain Aldrich struck the floor with the butt of his sword. "Let truth enter this hall." The doors opened. An elderly woman was guided inside, bent with age but clear of eye. Murmurs swept the chamber. It was the nurse, long believed dead. She told how flames had been set deliberately in the nursery, and how she fled with the infant princess to save her life. Next came a former palace servant who confessed he had been paid to unlock a passage door on the night of the fire. Then Aldrich presented ledgers seized from Varkane's country house. Hidden payments, bribes, and purchases made in the days before the blaze were read aloud by the royal clerk. The chamber erupted in outrage. Varkane shouted that the records were lies, but his voice shook. Guards closed around him before he reached the doors. "In the name of the crown, you are arrested," Aldrich declared. Chains were fastened before the eyes of every noble who once feared him. The king beckoned Seraphine forward with fading strength. A cushion was brought, bearing the heir's circlet of gold and white enamel. With trembling hands, he placed it upon her head. "My daughter," he whispered, "rule better than we did." Before sunset, he breathed his last. Months later, Ashbourne Estate stood renewed. Roofs were repaired, gardens replanted, and warm light filled every window. Former servants received fair wages, clean cottages, and respect long denied them. Seraphine returned there wearing a simple blue gown and no royal jewels. She walked the front steps where she had once been pushed toward the rain. "A throne is not made by crowns," she said to those gathered. "It is made by how one treats the powerless." She later passed laws protecting widows, servants, and the poor. And the girl once cast into the storm ruled the realm with grace.